Welcome to the fifth Zebinar. The issue of the week this week is gun violence. Per usual, we're going to go through a brief run-through, flashback of history, and then we're going to go through where we're at currently, and then future worth fighting for. We go over some policy and what should be done in order to combat this recent rise in gun violence and crime. So to begin with a flashback, looking at our history, I believe it's imperative that we start with the Second Amendment. And it's important because the original Constitution, it was creating a centralized government that the inhabitants of the United States at the time were afraid of. They just fought off a king. They did not want any chance of another tyrant taking over them and ruling their lives from some high off pedestal. So the Bill of Rights was important because it was checks on the federal government in regard to citizen rights. Now, the text of the Second Amendment is right there. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, since this is an amendment to the Constitution and it's stuck in the Constitution, you can't get rid of it unless you amend the Constitution to cancel it out. Case law governs it, Supreme Court case law. And two of the most important cases in regard to the Second Amendment are D.C. v. Heller and McDonald v. the City of Chicago. So in D.C. versus Heller, Scalia wrote the opinion. Excuse me, it's allergy season is starting. Right, so Scalia wrote the opinion for D.C. v. Heller, and it essentially gave an individualized right to own a firearm. And what Scalia said in his opinion was that at the time of the founding, a well-regulated militia would mean any able-bodied man. So now in present terms, in the 2000s, any able-bodied man would be any able-bodied person. So any citizen or resident of this country has an individualized right to own a firearm. Then what happened with McDonald was the Supreme Court said, since there is an individual right to own a firearm, it's being incorporated with the 14th Amendment, saying that states cannot abridge that right. So those two landmark cases kind of guide where we can go from here in order to create gun control legislation. But also we have to talk about the 90s crime wave, because this was the most recent crime wave to the one that we're witnessing right now. From the mid 80s to the early 90s, crime across the country in every sector peaked. And there are many causes to it. You can look at the inflation that was at record highs during the 70s, early 80s, that stagnant economy that really wasn't producing economic mobility. Like we saw in the last seminar on wealth inequality, this is when the wealth gap began to widen dramatically in comparison to the 40s, 50s, 60s. We also have the crack cocaine epidemic. That's a mental health issue. People are doing drugs, acting erratically. It screws up your neurological signals. So once you have a bunch of cracked out people, who knows what's going to happen? The solution to the 90s crime wave, though, was the 1994 crime bill. It really focused on mass incarceration and a big police presence in order to tamp down crime. And many people say the crime bill was instrumental in lowering the peak crime of the late 80s, early 90s. But you also have to remember that in 1994, the economy started to get better. So it's one of those chicken or the egg type things, which actually caused the decline in crime. Was it a booming economy or was it mass incarceration? As we see, mass incarceration really isn't paying huge dividends because crime is still a problem. So let's look at modern gun laws. And this is a quick rundown, just where federal gun laws have been. So when we look back at 1938 with the Federal Firearms Act, that said that if you're selling a firearm, you have to be a federal firearms licensee, an FFL, and those still exist today. Wasn't much legislation in regard to gun control, but that changed in 1968. And during the 60s, the civil rights era, that was a period where we saw a large number of assassinations around this country that was just absolutely ridiculous. We had a president get assassinated. The president's brother got assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. got assassinated. Malcolm X got assassinated. I mean, there were so many just outright death happening everywhere that the country realized, yeah, we got to do something about it. So we got the Gun Control Act, a huge piece of legislation that began to regulate guns. Then in 88, we get the Undetectable Firearms Act. And that's something that's making an emergence right now again because of ghost guns. So what that act says, the Undetectable Firearms Act, is that you can't have a gun that has less than a certain ounce of metal in it. So with the digital revolution, with new technologies emerging, people were able to create guns where you were able to pop pieces off and then get it through security and then pop them back on. Things like that. So you basically be able to carry guns to places that you weren't supposed to because the technology like metal detectors couldn't detect those guns. And then we get to the Brady Handgun and Violence and Prevention Act, and that basically passes background checks for most gun purchases. And Brady, I believe, is named after the guy that took a bullet during the attempted assassination of Reagan. Maybe wrong, but I think that's who it's named after. But it's the Brady bill. Background checks. Doesn't cover every single sale because, again, we're having this conversation right now about making background checks mandatory on every single gun sale, gun transfer, gun purchase, all of them. But then we also get to the 1994 crime bill, year after the Brady bill, and that was the assault rifle 10-year ban. So that banned most assault rifles, don't want to say all, for 10 years, from 1994 to 2004. It expired in 2004 and it was not renewed. And the crazy thing is that in 2004, the assault rifle ban ended. And then in 2005, Congress and George Bush passed legislation, signed it into law, that says gun manufacturers cannot be sued for negligence when people die from guns. So that's been very impactful for what's going on. I don't know if it's still affected because I know Sandy Hook, they were able to get a settlement out of that. But I don't know if well, again, I said settlement, so that wasn't actually a case. They settled it out of court. But I don't know if it was a settlement or if it was actually a verdict. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure if that law is still in effect. But this is pretty much all of the major federal legislation that we've had on guns. So not a lot. And legislation is good, but we also need an enforcement mechanism. And in the United States, the major enforcement mechanism is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF. And ATF has a long history back to the founding, just in regard to vices. So like it says, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. They were all kind of lumped together. And thinking about prohibition, once that came in and alcohol was outlawed, they needed an enforcement mechanism that was devoted solely to alcohol. So again, the bureau that's covering all of these vices continues to develop through the 1800s to the early 1900s until we get to 1972 when the modern ATF was formed. So ATF has rulemaking power. They make confusing rules. I saw this video of like, if you switch one thing out of a gun, it's now illegal. If you put something else in that's very similar, it's not legal. So the rules that ATF is making, it's not easy to follow. And this is what a whole lot of gun owners are talking about when they're saying, you keep saying pass these laws, but laws on the books are pretty comprehensive. They're just confusing. We need to actually work with the laws that we have instead of just passing new legislation. And I sympathize with them because that's an institutional issue with our executive branch being able to create good rules and good regulations. They're just not doing it. So a part of the problem with gun violence isn't just the laws on the books, but it's how the ATF has interpreted those laws on the books. But also to its detriment is the fact that the ATF hasn't had a permanent Senate-confirmed director since 2006. And we saw under the Trump administration how different it is when you have an acting director versus a Senate-confirmed director, and how effective agencies and organizations are within the executive branch when they don't have all of the power that comes with their position. So there are many issues with ATF in regard to enforcing gun legislation and tackling gun violence that needs to be addressed institutionally. So where are we at right now? And for me personally, I don't think enough time is taken to differentiate between the different types of gun violence. We often just hear gun violence and then we just lump everything together. And it's not all the same. The same policy will not fix all types of gun violence. And that's a realization that we need to come to if we want to have effective legislation and policy and actually lower these numbers and save lives. So what I've done is tried to come up with 4 major categories of gun violence in this country. And I think this pretty much sums it up. So it's either domestic violence, mass shootings, violent crime, or suicides. Gun violence usually falls into one of those categories. So in regard to domestic violence, that's something that varies across socioeconomic strata, across races, across genders, but most often it's a man that's assaulting a woman. So in the 1994 crime bill, there was the Violence Against Women's Act. That was also a part of it, in addition to the assault weapons ban. And again, there's also a push to get the Violence Against Women Act reauthorized now. It was some of Biden's signature legislation, actually. So the second one are mass shootings. Now, in this instance, it's usually white men, younger white men. If it's not them, more than likely it was a terrorist operation. That's pretty much the two. When there are mass shootings, when there are school shootings, it's one of the two. That's pretty much ingrained in our psyche at the moment. And these are political and psychological problems, because to shoot multiple people, to commit mass murder, something's not right. I mean, gun violence in general, to commit it, something's not right up here. There is a need for mental health outside of just banning guns. But I digress. We'll get there. Mass shootings also are known to be contagious. I watched an episode of Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, I believe it was, and there was an episode on gun violence. I think that's what it was. It may not be. But I was watching a documentary, but this woman, she was studying gun violence, and she realized that for about a 13-day period after a major mass shooting event, you can find instances of it being replicated. Why? She didn't dive much into that. Her research at the time of the documentary was probably still ongoing, but I think that's notable. Again, because each of these types of gun violence are separate and apart from each other, committed by different people in the population that require different policy in order to fix. Third category is violent crime related. Now, this is most often associated with minorities and Black people. This is socioeconomic. The gun violence is tied to other things. It's not just that people are going out and just shooting for no reason whatsoever. It's a drug deal gone bad, an argument that happened, turf wars and gang violence. But gun violence is a symptom of a larger issue in a community that's not just gun related. Just because you pass more gun laws, that's, again, I'll get into that. Because I'm digressing. The fourth category is suicides. Now, this is also mental health related. This is something where we're going to need to better our society in order to reduce the number of suicides. You can't just go around and take people's guns and expect suicides to suddenly drop. That's a mental health issue that, I'm sorry, that's my dog. Just a moment. But yes, you can't just take away guns and expect suicides to go down. But that's just one of the main things that guns are used for, is in suicides when it comes to gun violence. That's a huge, huge one. So knowing that those are the 4 categories, let's also go back to the crime wave and the pandemic crime wave. And when we look at the pandemic crime wave in terms of the 90s crime wave, the last one, major one that we had, we realize that crime that's reaching a peak now is also due to some of the same social issues. We have stagnant wages right now. We have high inflation. Just 2 years ago, we had unprecedented levels of unemployment. We also had people locked in their homes because of the pandemic. So many things that are social, that are economic, spark gun violence. Because gun violence is a symptom of larger issues in society and not necessarily an issue unto itself, if that makes sense, if you're following that. So we can't address gun violence directly. It's something that's going to occur from indirect sources, from indirect policy. And let's get to that. So what is combating gun violence going to look like? Just as a disclaimer, I'm not a person that grew up in a high crime neighborhood. I've been around guns. I've shot guns. I'm familiar with guns. But when it comes to actual gun violence, I'm not experienced on that. So this information that I'm giving is coming from as much as I've educated myself, and there's always room for improvement. But When we look at gun violence, like I said, it's a symptom, sorry about the typo, of a larger problem. The idea of banning guns, going back to saying an assault rifles ban, that's going to be antiquated. That's not going to work anymore. It's a waste of time. When Beto O'Rourke said it, it was stupid. It's a political miscalculation, and it's just ineffective. And you're probably saying, but if we can just get rid of these guns, the problem would be better. Again, the big three, the internet and digital technology. At the moment, people with 3D printers are printing their own guns. They are trading blueprints on the dark web. We can go ahead and ban all metal guns right now, but in 10 years, they're just going to pop back up in plastic form. So we need to stop this and start going to the root of the problem. The root of the issues behind gun violence, which is mental health, which is socioeconomic, which is a lack of firearm education. Because when you think about all of the rights that we have as citizens in this country, we learned about them in school. We learned about our right to vote, our right to petition, our right to free speech. All of these things, we learn about them and we educate ourselves on them, and much more can be done. But there's an effort made. At no point in our school system do we have any firearm education. We have a Second Amendment right, and we're not taught how to work with guns. Guns are a part of American culture. We're not just going to erase them. We're not going to get rid of them. You may not like guns. Some other people may. But learning about them, being educated about them, and learning the warning signs when people are going to commit gun violence will do much more than trying to focus on a ban, a political football that's not going to get past a good 60% of the country. Well, I shouldn't say 60% of the country. I'm not even going to throw out a statistic because I don't have any statistics on hand. Just a large portion of the country that's not going to get behind that type of legislation, just outright bans on guns. So what we need to do is allow ATF to do its job. We can start off by confirming a director. That's the least we could do. So they could actually tap into all of their constitutional authority and legal authority to make rules. But we also need to focus on breaking the cycle of violence. That's a huge thing. Also, in the documentary about the woman, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about how gun violence is contagious. It's also who you're connected to. And that once you realize who's doing what, who's going where, who's involved in this, you can literally determine with a very high confidence who is going to get caught up in gun violence, which again means that this is a symptom of a larger problem. Because you shouldn't be able to just say this person's involved in X, Y, and Z, and these people associated with them are probably going to get caught up in it if it wasn't due to X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z is the source, the root of the issue, and we need to get to it and fight it. That's poverty. That's addiction. That's bad relationships with people. And I'll get into more on that later. But what it comes down to is resources. There are people and nonprofits out there that do this work day in and day out. They know what needs to be done on the ground. They just lack the resources for it. So let's give them more. Let's give the nonprofits more money. The Stop the Violence movements more money because they're in the communities. They know the people they need to talk to, the people that are responsible for this. You can go and lock people up in jail, but that's not going to solve anything. Did crime reach a historic low after the crime bill? No, it didn't. And then now we're seeing that it's going right back up. And we haven't instituted that much reform since the 1994 crime bill for that to be a major difference in the results. So let's go through each of these individually. So in terms of domestic violence, one big thing that we can do right now is reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. That had huge implications for domestic violence. And we should focus on it. We've already done it. We've seen that it works. But we also need to do relationship education. Again, back to our schools. What are our public schools for? They're for a lot more than just learning about math, science, reading, and history. We need to teach people how to be good partners. What's healthy in a relationship? What's not? What's productive in a relationship? What's not? How do you, when you have these horrible thoughts, how do you seek help? Where do you seek help in regard to committing domestic violence? It's a mental health issue. And it's also often, more times than not, a substance abuse issue. Because usually in domestic violence situations, the perpetrator is usually abusing some sort of substance, whether it's drugs or alcohol. It's not just isolated. So we need to work on that and work on our communities and fixing our communities and again, investing in them. In regard to suicides, same thing. That's a mental health issue. It's not just going to be taking away guns if you want to stop suicides. That's much, much larger than just gun violence. We need to revolutionize our world so that it's not so taxing to live here, so it's not so brutal to be here. Because I've struggled with my own mental health, and I understand how much this world puts people down, and it makes it so that it's impossible to even get your bearings on straight to go out into the world and do what you need to do. So this again comes down to resources, having the options available for people to get the help they need when they need it. Mass shootings. Now, in this case, the guns are often legally acquired. So in this regard, background checks really aren't going to help. Gun banning really isn't going to help, especially in 10 years where you can print them. These are radicalized individuals that have seen an increase in mass shootings since the digital revolution. So that says something about our interconnectedness, the information that we're getting online, and then people going out and shooting up huge venues full of people. And the sad thing is that in these situations, since it's so deadly, we often don't get to talk to mass shooters after they commit their heinous crimes. We don't get to sit down and pick their brain and say, why did you do this? But in the few instances that we do, their head's not on straight. Again, mental health. It's back to the health of our society and our communities and how we're raising the next generation. Because these are often younger people, younger white men that are perpetrating these crimes. So let's talk about it. Let's get in there and figure out what's going on. We must. And again, it's much more than just banning guns. Because in these situations, if someone wants to commit mass murder and they don't have access to a gun or a semi-automatic or anything like that, they'll find a way to do it. They will. And that's the sad reality about the world that we live in, especially in the United States and the access to resources that we have, what you can buy, what you can find online. If someone really wants to commit mass murder, they can do it. And lastly, violent crime. And this is what I was getting into earlier. In terms of violent crime, this is where you start to get into illegal guns, people that should not have had the guns that they had. That's true in mass shootings oftentimes, but what I mean by legally obtained guns in that case, usually a child takes their parent's gun or something like that. It's not as if the gun itself wasn't supposed to be in the household. In terms of violent crime, a lot of times the gun was not supposed to be in the household. So you have straw purchases. That's where someone who can't purchase a gun sends someone in to buy the gun for them. In these instances, it's hard to, it's like when you go to the store and you buy something for somebody else. You can't know when you're selling a gun if this person is buying it for themselves or somewhere else. Yes, there are warning signs, like if they're on the phone asking, which one do you want this? But that's easy to address. When you have systematic efforts to go in and commit straw purchases, that's a whole lot harder to do than anything else. Also, stolen guns. I just saw something on Instagram about someone who got their car broken into and their gun stolen. I already know that gun's going to end up in some violent crime somewhere down the line. And again, what this comes back to is a socioeconomic issue, problems with our communities. And we need to invest the resources in our communities so that this is not a viable means of living your life. Because what's a person going to do when they don't have an education, they don't have access to education, they don't have the resources to get a higher education, none of that. Their option is to go work a minimum wage for $7.25, or they can probably sell drugs. When the lights are going to go off, when you can't afford the bills, and you know you can sell drugs to make more money, which one are you going to do? At the end of the day, which one are you going to do? Are you going to support your family and sell drugs? Probably. But what comes with that is the risk of violence. So what are people going to do? They're going to go out and get guns. But once you go... Sorry about that. But I'm not exactly sure where I left off. But this is an instance where gun buyback programs work because the guns aren't legal. So we need a means to get these back. So for instance, in mass shootings where kids are taking their parents' guns or people have guns that they've legally bought, a buyback program is not going to work because they got the gun. In instances where people have come across illegal guns, buyback programs will work. And this is what I'm talking about when it takes different approaches to fix different issues with gun violence. We can't look at it as a monolith because no monolithic policy is going to solve these four issues in tandem. Domestic violence, suicides, mass shootings, and violent crime all stem from the same place. Again, mental health, socioeconomic issues, but they don't go out in the same direction or from the same groups of people. So we need tailored policy for different responses. And in terms of violent crime, it's the community organizations that know what's going on. They know what's happening in their communities. They know who the perpetrators of violence are. No one really wants to go and turn people into the police until it comes to that point. But it's about forming better communities, building community relationships, partnerships, and investing in communities so that people have a better means to live. I think that's where I was going. In regard to violent crime and people being forced into it, if you have to go to Wendy's and work for $7.25, or you can sell drugs, you're going to sell drugs. Along with that comes the risk of violence, but that's a risk you're going to have to take when you know the other option is not being able to pay for your bills. That's not sustainable either. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and people are making hard decisions. So if we provide the resources to the communities, I'm 100% certain that no one wakes up in the morning. Well, some people do. But most people are not waking up in the morning thirsting for violence. It's not a life that they want to live. It's a life that they have been forced into, and we need to give them a way out.